So this is a work by Anna. She was the first one to send in something, so she gets to go first. Yay, Anna. So the first thing we do is tell the facts about the piece. So Anna, this is a chance for you to talk. It is very quickly size, technique, finished, unfinished, framed, unframed, part of a series, standalone, the title, you know, just the bare basic facts.
Title is Gathering Pumpkins. It stands alone. It's a little bigger than 11 by 14. It's thread painted. The pumpkins are all thread painted, and the background is quilted, and the background is all painted. And I also paint on top of the thread paint, and then I use sew. And the stems are either thread painted or hand stitched, so it's a little bit of everything.
And the hay down at the bottom, is that?
The hay is floss. Yeah, it's done, yeah, just regular floss.
Hand stitched. Okay, so now we start with, so when you start, oh, another thing, you can use a few descriptors for the facts. We can say, what style is this? It's representational as opposed to abstract. And it's not impressionist, it's not really, what's the word I'm thinking of that's like folk art, primitive. You know, it's just a representational, lovely autumn scene. Okay, so now we talk about the elements. We have 5 elements. If it was 3-dimensional, more than this, we could talk about the 6th element of form, as well as texture, shape, color, value, line. So let's have Ellen start with. Now, not every piece is really strong with all 5 elements. So usually you choose one element that is strongly represented here, and then describe what is happening with that element. So Ellen, choose an element and then describe what you see and where it is.
Well, what jumps at me, obviously, first of all, is color. The fact that you're working with two they're contrasting colors, they're opposite on the color wheel. Am I right about that? They really make one another pop. Particularly the orange, it just really jumps out at you. And the fact that you're using a contrast. Instead of a brown in the stems, you used a black, and that really adds a lot of depth to it, to me. And then the addition of the light yellow at the bottom really sort of draws you in. I just love the way the colors move. It's so pretty. And the blue, particularly the way you've quilted it, gives you, it looks like it's deeper the closer it is to the, a little darker the closer it is to the pumpkins. And as you go further up and away from the pumpkins, it gets lighter, which really sort of gives it movement and depth. I think it's beautiful.
Okay, so that was color and value together, and we have to be aware that when we're not all in the same room with the same lighting, things might show up differently on our screen. So the first thing you said was the 2 main colors are complementary. That's the color scheme. It doesn't fit super tight, orange and blue. It's the blue goes into green blue, kind of an aqua, the orange goes to yellow and brown, but that's how we categorize colors. In artwork, it's never a super tight box. The pumpkin stems saying that they were black and really popped out, that's value. That is the dark and the light in each color. And on my screen, they are showing up as purple and green. and stitching in the stems. When I squint really hard, they are black and then they go to lighter. And it's really interesting that as I squint, some of the lighter areas that when I squint really hard, which blurs everything out for me, my eyes are pretty bad. So it's pretty easy to blur out all the details. It does change to black and then a highlight kind of gray, but it's purple and green when I look at it. Up close and purple. Up close and purple, personal. And it is interesting that the value shifts a little bit from the top to the bottom in the blue. And we have value shifts within each stem and each pumpkin that create a sense of depth and dimension because of the highlights and the shadows. And the lightest value color is actually down at the bottom with the floss straw. So all of those things are really interesting. So you're right that the complementary color gives a real pop. Complements make each other look more of what they are. They accent each other. Okay, color and value. Diane, do you want to choose another element and talk about it?
I'll choose line because it's present everywhere in many forms. In the pumpkins, it really contributes to a sense of almost movement, but lets you know there's varied shapes and they're just kind of randomly placed in a pile, and it really adds to the texture and feel of the piece. And then it contrasts with, and those are very clear, delineated lines.
Are you talking about the lines of black stitching that are on each pumpkin?
Yes.
Okay, so anytime you talk about line, describe what the line is and where it is, and then tell what it does. You're doing really well. Keep going.
Okay. So the other lines are up in the sky, and they're very random and dense and overlapping, and it contrasts nicely with the well-defined pumpkin shapes below and adds to the texture of the piece. And then the stem lines, they're in for each of the pumpkins. They have a different texture to them. I think they've been hand stitched, a lot of them, which adds another dimension to line there. And then finally, the straw at the bottom has a lot of individual lines that add to texture. So well done. I love this piece.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, and what you were talking about is an overlap between line and texture, because in this piece, those two elements create each other. They're part of each other. The line of the straw is kind of directional, but it's created in that very, very textural, three-dimensional, real kind of way. Susan, what would you like to say about this? Do you want to choose an element?
Well, the picture does go out of frame. I forgot what it was called, whatever. It's not all contained. It's on the edge, on the lower right-hand edge. There's
open form.
Open form, thank you. And the overall composition where the field of orange pumpkins is almost equal to the sky area. So there's that balance in those, but I see. I think I would talk about repetition. Okay, that'll be it.
Okay, so wait a second.
Yeah, different things.
Yeah, so far the three things you've talked about are all principles instead of an element, which is totally fine. You talked about balance. My brain is lost, so I don't know what the other one was.
Okay.
But we've talked so far about line and color and value and textures. So shape is the one thing that's left. Do you want to describe the shapes you see here and what they're doing.
Okay. So from the top, the sky, well, the sky's the background. Concerning shape, there's repetition of shape with variance so that they're not all uniform shapes.
Mhm.
The pumpkins are tilted so that instead of being all lined up, they're grouped together. They're not separated. They're all clumped together. And the stems go in, though all of them seem to go mostly upward, they're all tilted at angles instead of being all arranged in the same configuration, so that it's like a natural, like something that just randomly occurred instead of something that was arranged.
Right. Very good. So if we describe the shapes here, the first thing you said was that the overall piece is kind of divided equally between the sky and the pumpkins. So those are two equal, it's like a big diagonal shape on the top and on the bottom if you group all the bottom half together. And then the shapes are broken down into the smaller round pumpkins. And because we have knowledge of what that image is of, we know that those shapes are all tilted at different places. So line draws your eye, texture makes you want to touch it, shape gives activity and meaning. We understand those round shapes and lines and the stems, that collection to mean pumpkin. And then the differing tilts of the pumpkins make your eye move in random areas. There's no one line specifically for the eye to follow. It jumps from pumpkin to pumpkin here. And it's all, you know, none of it is a judgment. That's just what we're seeing. So very good. Now let's go. Susan, I'm going to have you continue. Why don't you talk about the elements that you were going to talk about? You say a little bit more about balance and then the other one that I can't remember that you were going to say.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. It's all good. It's all good.
So, I'm sorry, I'm having a...
What were we getting to? Let's talk about the principle of balance, and you talked about repetition and variety. Let's talk about those.
It's the, even though it's a repeated object, the fact that it's varied in positioning and even there's repetition of the colors in the stems, which makes that a unified thing. And then there's the repetition of orange and the highlighted areas that are the pumpkins. And so your eye is going to be drawn around the area where the pumpkins are, and it's going to be, it's like the it's hard to separate things into very succinct categories, isn't it?
Yeah, but you don't have to be super distinct. This is an educational process in these specific critiques.
Yes.
You know, I'm hoping to educate you in a very clear and objective thinking process. And you're right, it is impossible to separate everything, and that's okay. That's okay. All right. Ellen, let's go back to you. What other principle do you see happening in here, and would you like to describe?
Well, there's a rhythm to it.
Describe the rhythm and describe how that rhythm is, what the elements are doing to create that rhythm.
Well, the way the pumpkins are placed, in the lower right-hand corner, you have 3 pumpkins that are sort of in a almost in a line. Two definitely are, and one is not. And then they sort of move in almost a wave-like motion, where the next line you have 4 pumpkins that are in a line and one that's not, and then it moves up from there and gets more jumbled. So it's sort of like, you know, you're going from order to disorder almost.
Good observation. Diane, what other observations do you have about this? What principle would you like to describe? Got rhythm and motion and balance and
Balance.
okay.
There's a good balance in the piece between the pumpkin area and the blue sky above.
What kind of balance? How would you describe it? Is it symmetrical, asymmetrical? Does the balance work? What makes it work?
It works. I don't know if I'd go symmetric, asymmetric. It's just a separation of the plane that provides enough contrast in the piece. It's almost 1/3, 2/3, with the pumpkins taking more of the area than the sky.
Only by a little. And it's interesting because the sky is kind of plain,
Yeah.
even though the texture is very intense there with the stitching all over it. But the imagery in the lower half is very complex and really attracts your attention. So even there, it's, I mean, if we divided it up mathematically,
Yeah.
it's closer to 1/2, but the bottom half is so complex and so interesting that it has more visual weight to it.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yes. Good critique, Lyrica.
All good. All right. Scale, proportion, depth, and space, focal point. Susan, do you want to tell us if there's a focal point and talk about how the idea of depth is created in this piece?
Okay. What I see is that through the use of the lighter color at the top of the piece going down towards the middle, there's a darker area in the blue field. And that helps to establish a sense of like openness at the top, and then at the where it's darker.
Is it the bottom? Yep.
Yeah.
Makes perfect sense.
And then also like the detail in the front lower right corner, that is the floss, that is like more, there's like more detail. Everything is separated. You can see very, you know, like the individual strands. And then the details with the pumpkins, it's more of, even though you can see the form, there's not like the grain texture, or it's not as large as a small, it doesn't, so it meets the foreground, the floss makes it seem like that's closer to the viewer.
Right. So this is a really good description of how depth is created on a two-dimensional plane. There's a lot of different things. So higher values tend to feel more comfortable up high. Lower values tend to feel comfortable down low within the frame. We've got shadows and highlights on each pumpkin. And then in real life, there's just so much more detail when you're looking at something, the closer to your eyes it is. So as you go down the frame, the most textural and dimensional detail is in that straw on the bottom, so it feels closest to you.
And also like color, because the brighter areas seem to be closer than in the pumpkins and in the straw even.
Right.
Just
Very good. All right, let's go. It's a pretty, do you all feel like we covered the principles and elements, describing them objectively pretty well here? I'll take that as a yes. Let's go through how, a fun question to ask is always, of all of the viewers, does anybody have something they want to tell us this? How does this make you feel? What does it remind you of? Does it bring up any associations or ideas?
Just one thing, it makes me feel happy. It's, you know, the colors and the composition, it puts me in that place.
So can you describe in any way what about it makes you feel happy? You said colors.
Right, right.
What about the colors?
The brightness and the clarity of the colors.
Okay, so for you, this is the valuable part when you are in a critique session and looking at other things, to ask yourself that question, what is it about it that attracts me to this piece? And for you, it is clear, saturated colors. And since we named the color composition as complementary, perhaps complementary colors, and it might be specifically a blue and orange complementary color scheme are part of your happy place.
It's not usually, so I think it's more nostalgia.
All right. So, and that's a thing too. The meaning of the shapes brings memories to you. Maybe you have experience and memories of happy times in a pumpkin patch, who knows? Okay, anybody else have something they want to say about this? Nope. Okay, Anna, is there any questions you have for the rest of us about this piece? And is there anything else you want to tell us about it shortly?
I really appreciate everything that everybody has said. It really helps to see my piece other than the emotional investment that I've put into it. One of the things that I have showcased this piece several times, and one of the things that I think it was even hard in this critique was there is no focal point. Or is there? And that has plagued me.
Do you have to have a focal point in order for a piece to be successful?
And that is a question too, yes. Do you or no?
I think that answer is different for every person. I've seen many very successful pieces with no focal point, and many successful pieces with a focal point. So there's no one answer to that.
That's good to know, because I'm really happy with the way it is. I don't necessarily want to necessarily put a focal point, but I have had a lot of feedback on the fact that it doesn't have one, but it doesn't make me want to change it.
Well, then you're good. You don't, whenever you have feedback, you take it in and you chew on it for a while. Mm-hmm. And you swallow the stuff that tastes good and you spit out the rest, right? So you are the artist. Mm-hmm. You are the one who has the final say. You are the only one if you want to be a successful artist, you are the only one you really have to please. The job of the art itself is not to please all the viewers. It's to speak your vision as the artist. And when you speak your own vision, not everybody will speak your same language, but somebody will.
Yeah.
And that's I think the most important thing for artists to do and understand is that it's your own language it's your vision you're trying to fulfill, not trying to please everybody else. Okay.
Thank
you. Well done, Anna. Thank you so much. Okay. Let's go to Diane's piece. And since this picture is more clear, hold on. I have to get it all nice and big before I share it. There we go.
Ooh, wow.
Okay, Diane, tell us the dimensions, tell us the facts about this piece.
I didn't measure it recently, so it's a pretty average wall hanging piece, maybe like 18 by 24 or something like that.
Yep, that's good. Because without context in a piece, we don't know if it's 100 by whatever or 10 by whatever. So, you know, we don't have to know exactly, but now we have an idea of the scale.
I'm part of a design study group where we set up a challenge every year for us to work on, and I actually forget what the challenge was. But
Okay, so all we really need to know is what it's made of. You can describe it as finished or not. It's meant to hang on the wall, what techniques were used. We'll get into the whys and the stories about it after we do the objective analysis. Sound good?
can I tell you the title?
Yeah, that's part of the facts, yes.
Okay. It's called a homage to Annie Albers. And it was inspired by a rug design of hers.
Okay.
And it's made of a combination of satins and silks and upholstery fabric and some specialty fabrics like the copper. It's all pieced on the machine, except you'll notice there's a couple pins in the center there. This piece remains unfinished in my mind because I can't decide what that center should look like.
Okay, so that's an important thing to know, that it's possibly in process.
It's been that way for several years. I tried different things on that center. I had a vision for it originally, and I kept playing with it, and now I don't know where it could be. So now it's in my UFO pile and gets pulled out every once in a while. So that's one of the reasons I put it up here for today for discussion.
Okay, so let's talk it through. Susan, why don't you choose one of the elements, texture, shape, line, color, or value? And if color is it, you probably have value in there as well.
Okay, let's go with line. In this piece, shape would have been easier. Line, I see that there are sparse quilting lines that are used to, it's like an open stitch. I'm sorry. I may not be the best person to go first. Okay.
All you need to do is describe the lines you see and where they are and what they're doing.
Okay.
And you can describe how they're made if you want to. But all you do, the easiest thing to do is say, I see this line here. You can say it's fat or thin, moving in this direction. You can use a few words to describe that line. You're making it harder than it needs to be. You've got this. You can do
Right.
this.
Thank you. Okay. So in this piece, I see that line is used not only in like the piecing of the work, but also in the finishing of the work. So there are thin lines that go from on the upper top from left to the right, and that is like at the very top middle, there's a line that goes down, and then also from the middle left down to the lower right. And so there are a few lines that, then there's another line, that's two lines that start from the top left that go down diagonally through the piece down to almost bracket the lower right corner. There are also lines that go from the upper right that cut down, or it's like a little bit down, like more
Are
towards.
you talking about the lines that are created by the edges of the shapes that are pieced?
Okay. Yeah, I was just talking more about the lines that are added after.
So the quilting stitch
The
lines.
quilting stitch lines. Okay, see, that's good.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so there's like they're not dense. They're just there to, oh, sorry. Okay, and also the line of, from, in the shapes, there's a very hard edge line right there, yes. And so the dark color, that line is, it makes it like separates from the background.
Okay, good.
Because of
What
that.
about these? Can you guys see my bright yellow cursor thingy? Okay, good.
And then there's an accent of copper line. Because of that copper line is thinner, it's more, it appears more as a line rather than a shape to me.
Very good. Okay, excellent. A few other things you could say just really quickly and clearly is there's 3 very thin coppery shapes that are pointed lines. You could say that the stitching that are the thin textural lines are all straight lines. They're kind of random. They're not on a completely horizontal and vertical grid. They're not, so they're irregular lines. So, you know, just again, super, super simple, super good. Excellent job, Susan. Thank you. Anna, do you want to take a different element? You're muted.
I'll take the element of shape.
Okay.
She has, well, the piece is a certain shape, and then she uses, they're not triangles, but they're, what are 4 sides?
Is it a rhomboid or it's a wonky rectangle?
Yeah.
A very technical name for it.
Yeah.
Trapezoid.
Which I find it interesting.
Thank you, Diane.
Yeah. So it's, because it feels like it softens the triangle, which I like. I like the way she uses the shape, the same shape, but turns it in different directions so that it actually gives movement to the piece. So I like that.
Yeah, there's a lot more movement to these shapes than if they were all horizontal and vertical. And having them skewed in different directions gives it more movement.
Yeah, it's a lot of repetition of shapes.
Right.
Yeah.
Even though none of the shapes are exactly the same, our mind kind of sees them as overlapping rectangles. Ellen, do you want to take a different element? We've talked about line and shape. Do you want to talk about color and value?
Well, the fact that you're using, I'm looking at my color chart thing right now and trying to figure out if it's analogous colors or, because they're all fairly closely grouped on the color wheel.
Right. You might call this kind of a split complementary. So the 2 major colors are what?
Blue and,
Well, it's like on my screen, it looks almost like a turquoise.
We've lost your sound. You need to get a little closer to your microphone.
Oh, okay, sorry.
There you go.
New computer, haven't figured it out yet. The color is almost, well, on my screen, it's like a turquoise almost, the lighter large rectangle, and then the 2 shapes, one was like a triangle. That one is almost like a triangle that's been cut off, which is also sort of a turquoise color. And then the darker, I can't tell if they're like a red purple or if it's a darker blue. And then of course the centerpiece is that gorgeous red. It looks like it has a shimmer to it, almost like
it is reflective.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I would say it's predominantly green blue. It's got dark blue in it, and then the center is a red-orange with coppery yellow orangey little line triangles. So it's got two opposite kind of color schemes going on. In the reflective area, you see a little bit of an echo of the copper here. And the values go from light on the outside to a little bit darker to very dark, backing off back to dark. So we've got values and colors, and the texture is sometimes smooth. The piece in the center looks almost like it's a mesh, like it would be rough if you touched it, compared to the satiny smoothness of the outside. Okay, let's talk about balance and symmetry. Who wants to do that? Do you want to try it, Susan?
In this piece, I think that the repetition of the three copper lines, they're pretty uniform in shape and even their size. So that gives a sense of balance. The centerpiece, the rectangle mesh, is in purport, is like a smaller ratio of the outer edge of the piece.
Right.
So there's that. And it is placed in the center. So that's like where your eye goes, and it creates a balance, you know, like it's a balanced piece because it's like mostly rectangular at this. So it's like
right.
Even on the sides, on the top and the bottom.
Right. So I would say that even though it's not exactly symmetrical on either sides of an axis, it has a very symmetrically balanced feeling to it because of the distribution of the visual weight. Nothing's really heavily off to one side or the other.
Right. And the dark blue shape, the upper blue triangle and the lower blue triangle are relatively the same, so that even though they're not exactly the same, there's a balance in that.
Very good. Anna, do you want to talk about rhythm and motion?
So with rhythm and motion, I think like I said, the way the shapes are off balance helps, it gives it this movement.
Mm-hmm.
So I like that. I like that, you know, the dark blue, it goes one way and then it brings the light blue, the teal blue back into this other way. So it gives it this movement. Rhythm, I think the lines bring a lot of rhythm to it. The quilted lines, you know, they go in and out of each other. So that gives it like, you know, music playing. So that's how I see rhythm in the piece.
Right, very good. Ellen, do you want to talk about focal point and unity?
Well, obviously the focal point is the red rectangle in the center, which again is just very striking. And the other point was, what did you say, unity?
Unity, does it feel unified, and how so?
Yes, it does. It's almost like a study of.
You backed away again, so we've lost you.
Sorry, it's almost, to me, a study of how a rectangle looks if you look at it from a different angle, and the fact that one is piled on top of the other and it's sort of coming towards you. It's like this composition of what would happen if you were looking at this rectangle from over here.
Right. Okay. All right, everybody unmute. What other things would you like to say about this? Does anything attract your attention Does anything stick out to you? Does it remind you of anything? We're not going to say it's good or bad. You can say, I see this thing doing this. So all that.
I do want to say that I see I love how the blues and the work together, and even the orange copper. The red for me is a little, I'm having a little trouble with it. And I just,
Explain, so can you describe what makes it stand out to you?
it's just there. It's not flowing with the rest of the piece. It's just there.
How
And
so?
The shape is different. So it doesn't feel like it's a square versus the whole piece has these beautiful, so the shape itself doesn't go with the piece. Maybe that's what is bothering me, that the shape is totally different than the rest of the shapes in the piece.
Okay. Anybody else?
I do like the copper lines.
Mhm.
I think that they really, they have that, it's like that accent pulls your eye right there into, from the border into that section. So that's like what I like most about this piece. That's not the right
Good.
word.
I would say that the layering of the blues and the teals is very nice with the different directions. I see that red block in the center is very strong with its very different texture. It's a very big block of a very dominant color. The addition of the copper lines on the outside really balances it and draws your eye around. But that red, you're right, is different from everything else. So perhaps it's overbalancing the rest of what we're seeing. Anybody else have things before we open it up to Diane for questions?
Would that be like what might be problematic with this piece is that that the red is actually kind of the same proportions as the overall piece?
I never say it's a problem.
Right.
I just describe what I see because Diane's the one who has to decide if it's a problem or not.
Problematic. I don't always see that as a negative thing. It's just something to be.
Yeah, so Diane, right,
Definitely.
Diane's the one who has to decide if that's what she wants or doesn't want. And also, obviously, it's unfinished.
Yes.
So we see raw edges and stringy bits where everything else is pure and clean, but we know it's unfinished, so that doesn't really factor in. Okay, Diane, do you have questions for us or comments?
Well, so you've picked up on that centerpiece, that the bright red, and it's actually an overlay of like a gold mesh on top of a printed red fabric underneath.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree that that big blob there doesn't work. And it needs to be, it was more angled originally, and I kept playing with it, and this was, I don't know, the first picture I found of this piece to show you. And I've been struggling with how to finish that center section and not take away from the background design.
So you might want to consider repetition. So you've got one shape in the center that is only repeated by the outer shape. All the rest of them are trapezoids, and then you've got a rectangle with 45-degree corners on it. Also, if you have something as powerfully different as that red in the middle, as far as different texture, very, very, yellow's a diva. If yellow's not there, orange and red become the divas. How much red do you need to balance the rest? And sometimes, in order to balance a big piece of red like that, you need to draw a little bit of it somewhere else into the composition to integrate it more. So right now the red is saying, look at me. And those copper things around the outside serve to draw the eye around, but they're also different from the red.
Yeah.
So you need to, it sounds like you're struggling with how to integrate that into the piece more. Usually repetition really helps with integration of the elements.
Okay.
Any other questions? It's got a lot of potential. This is
Yeah.
I enjoy this piece.
Yeah, and thank you again for helping us to learn how to speak about a piece.
Yeah, sure.
Over here.
Yeah, okay, so let's go to Susan. You sent me 4 pieces. Do you care which one we do?
Oh, no, it's just your discretion.
Okay, I'm just going to, I randomly clicked on one. So there we go.
Nice.
All right.
Okay,
So,
Susan, tell us the facts.
okay, this piece is titled All That You Dream. It is a wall quilt. It is approximately 72 inches by 65 inches across. It is made of commercial fabrics. It is part of a series. It is like the next to the last piece. It was informed by pieces. The pieces before it were 10 by 12 pieces, and so I expanded that out into a larger piece. It is straight line quilted. I don't know if that's necessary, but oh, that would be it. It's fabric that is pieced and quilted.
Okay,
Nice.
very good. And we can say that it's abstract.
Yeah.
It's not representational. I mean, that's indisputable. All right, so let's go through the elements here. Let's start with Diane. Why don't you start us off and talk about whichever element is strongest in this piece to your eyes? Texture, shape, line, color, value.
Did you say shape?
Shape is one of the elements, yes.
Okay, I just see squares everywhere, so that dominates for me in terms of the overall look of the piece. I mean, there's a lot more going on than that, but I see that as a dominant repeating shape.
Right. So that, just describing the shapes you see, and tell us more about the squares. How many, what more can you tell us?
There's different scales to them.
Mm-hmm.
All kind of randomly placed. They
Very
use
good.
color schemes, although it's always black and white, but there's different combinations of that in each of the squares. I don't know, that's about it.
Okay, good. So you have random, it's mostly squares. We have some rectangles, some of the squares are joined, some are separate. You're right, all black and white, different scale. They're kind of evenly scattered across the piece. Perhaps the square within a square within a square, the black and white targets of squares might be a dominant design element because they are repeated. It feels like they're bigger and more of them just by a little bit at the bottom. There was something I was going to say and I forgot. Anna, why don't you go next? Pick an element.
I'm picking texture.
Go for it.
I love, even though you're looking at a picture and it looks flat because of all, it looks like there's so many different fabrics with so many different patterns in it that it feels like it's very textural to me.
As far as pattern is concerned?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, as far as patterns, the patterns in this piece, for me, gives it a lot of texture.
Excellent. So that's a visual texture.
Visual.
Patterning. Ellen, we've talked about shape and texture. We've got line and color and value.
Line. Of course, you've got the squares, but what you don't notice as much are the smaller rectangles that have like lines running vertically and horizontally within the longer white rectangle. And those sort of lead your eye through all the maze of squares.
Very good. So we can say that even though the patterning here feels very random, it's also orthogonal. It's all vertical and horizontal, all very perpendicular to each other. And, you know, it's interesting what you said, as we move through the maze, the positive and negative space here, what feels like the background, the black, compared to the foreground, the more colorful and the white shapes. It's random, but at the same time, it's not. This feels very city map-like to me, like an overhead feel. That was a personal meaning to the shapes that came to my mind. Who have we forgotten? Susan's not talking on this one. Diane talked, and Anna talked, and Ellen talked. Color, we've got kind of primary color here, red, yellow, and blue, mostly neutral. It's really interesting that on my first look, Anna, you were talking about patterning and texturing. On my first look, I just saw black and white, but as you look closer, there's like a gray pattern. There's something down, one of the fabrics looks a little greenish, but predominantly it's red, yellow, and blue, but those are not, I mean, those are strong colors, and it's a strong triadic color scheme, but it's definitely shape and value, that stark black and white, that are much more dominant than color here. Okay, let's talk about some of the principles. Who wants to talk about unity and variety and how that's created? Susan? Oh, wait a minute, you're the artist. Never mind, Diane. Do you want to talk about unity and variety here and how it's created?
Well, the unity again is the through the repetition of shapes.
Very good.
With the large squares really pull together the smaller elements of the piece, and then the repetition of those squares at different scales add further to the unity.
Right. And at the same time, there's great variety.
Yeah.
It's hard to find exact repetitions of anything here, but at the same time, it's enough that it's very unified. Anna, do you want to talk about rhythm and motion again?
Yeah, and I think the rhythm and motion goes with the color. The little pops of red here and there. There's a dance going on with the red.
So one thing that I see with the red when I just think about the red, as soon as you said that, is my eyes jumping from one place to the next, and it's pretty fairly evenly scattered with the medium-sized red shapes. What else?
Also the motion, you know, of the lines going up, it does give that feel of, you know, little roads, you know, moving, you know, like you said, it feels like a city, but the lines in those black, just, it moves me up, moves me down through the piece.
Which lines?
The black, the textured lines on the black.
The quilting lines?
I guess
that's, so it looks like there's either a printed pattern or quilting lines that are all up and down, vertical. Also these long skinny strips,
yeah,
they're also all vertical. There are shapes and places that are horizontal, but the dominant direction of motion here feels like it is up and down vertical. Balance and symmetry and or scale and proportion. Ellen, do you want to take that on?
balanced. To me, it looks like the preponderance of the black areas are in the center of the quilt. You know, as you get out to the edges, it's not quite as densely black as it is in the center of it. So it sort of draws you in. Scale, it's very balanced, even though the squares are not necessarily the same shapes, or some of them look to be a little distorted. They're very nicely placed. So you just sort of move from one to the next.
Yeah, so it's kind of a very even balance throughout the whole piece. So it has, just like the last one we saw, felt symmetrically balanced, although there wasn't perfect symmetry here. This one feels like a very crystallographic balance. So it's evenly balanced shapes all over the place. There's no one place that really has more visual weight than anything else. I think the same goes for focal point. This is a piece that can be very successful with no one focal point. There is still, when you don't have a focal point, a lot of times it's still nice to have a pleasing journey for the eye to take. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to stop at one place, as long as the eye is interested in moving around the piece in a certain way. Although some pieces might, well, never mind. I was going to say, if a piece is very still and quiet, it usually has a focal point for you to stop and rest at of some sort. All right, Susan, do you have any questions for us?
Right, well, that was the main comment that was like, that I was like, that I received on this quilt is the lack of the focal point or a place for your eye to rest. And I was like, but that's not the point. So, I was like, that helps me to understand, like whenever my concern was more about moving, you're not supposed to stay in one spot. You're supposed to keep moving, so if you, I don't know, do you have a...
If that was your specific goal, you very much succeeded, because there is a definite, you're moving the whole time. Your eyes are moving the whole time you see this piece. And it's a lovely, balanced, really, really interesting journey. There's something to see everywhere your eye goes as you move around this piece.
And I could say slightly what my inspiration piece on it was. The popularity of the Gypsy Wife quilt. I kind of had this was my counter to that. Because some of those are so hard to read. And so I was like, I did change from my original idea, because that was just my starting point. But those quilts evoke crowdedness, and there's just a multitude of shapes in those quilts. And so I kind of riffed off of that. Okay.
And that's one of those interesting things that is only in your head.
Right.
And like I'm not familiar with those, so I have no point of reference. So the quilt has to stand on its own. And even if it was in an artist statement is a place to name those kind of things and then give people a point of reference inside your head or not. You can choose to do that or not. So I think you all did a really, really good job today. Thank you for watching. Leave a comment and let's have a conversation. I would also love it if you subscribe to my YouTube channel or check out lyrickinard.com, where you can find wonderful art and textile related things. Bye for now.